Everyone, we're going to get started. My name is Julie Tedjeske Crane, and I'm a librarian at Penn State Dickinson Law. And I'm going to be talking about online discussion boards. I have two handouts. You can see there's a QR code on the screen. The first handout is just basically a textual version of the slides. The slides are basically just verbal visual cues. So this is sort of my speaker notes. And then the second handout is actually 6 discussion board prompts. 1 from my first year legal research class, and then 5 from an advanced legal research class that I teach. So you can look at these, sort of adapt them. If you want to use them in your class, that's perfectly fine. If not, that's fine too. So in terms of discussion boards, these can be a really good tool for having sort of peer-to-peer interaction between students. So students are supposed to be learning a lot of different ways in your classes. They should be learning from the course materials. They should be learning from interacting with you, the instructor. And then they're also supposed to be learning from interacting with each other. So, you know, peer-to-peer interaction is supposed to be part of the learning process. And discussion boards are a great way to take care of that. I really like this quote. Okay, so now my slides are fancy. Okay, this is the quote. It comes from the Working Group on Distance Learning in Legal Education. And the quote is, in a live class, typically the most outgoing and verbal students are well known by the professor, but in an asynchronous classroom, all voices are heard. And that's kind of a great thing about the discussion boards. Everybody, by design, has to be part of the discussion. And even though the quote's about asynchronous classrooms, really, in asynchronous classes, a lot of times the peer-to-peer interaction is happening on the discussion board. Also, another aside on the quote is that discussion boards are an asynchronous tool, meaning that it's not like a real-time conversation. So you might have somebody posting on Friday, somebody replying on Sunday, etc. But that doesn't mean that they're only for asynchronous online courses or even only online courses. I use discussion boards in my traditional face-to-face classes all the time. So that's just a takeaway. People kind of think of them as being an online class tool, but really you can use them in a lot of different contexts. So what I'm going to talk about is the different types of discussion boards, sort of the nuts and bolts of running these things, and then we're going to finish up with an example from one of my classes. So in terms of the types of discussion boards, there's sort of 2 ways of looking at this. The first way is looking at what is the objective of the board. And whenever I say this, what I'm talking about is where does the discussion board sort of fit into the class big picture. And anytime you're looking at any element of your class, you want to make sure that it ties to a learning objective somehow. So you want to do that for your discussion boards too. One way of using your discussion boards in a course is obviously introductions. This is probably the most common way people use discussion boards in courses. Very simple, you know, where did you go to undergrad? Why did you come to law school? That sort of thing. Next is initial engagement. So the idea here is that the discussion board comes before the main treatment of the topic. So say you have a face-to-face traditional class. You might have the students doing readings before the class. You could have a quiz in the LMS to make sure they did the readings, or you could have a discussion board in the LMS, have them discuss the readings before class, then take some of the takeaways and good points from that discussion, maybe some of the muddy points from that discussion, and use that as the springboard for your treatment of the topic whenever you get to it in your face-to-face class. Sort of the opposite would be application. So here, you have that same face-to-face class, you talk about your topic, in class, and then the discussion board is something where they go and they apply what they learned in the face-to-face class. Very similar would be extension. So application is basically you learn something, you apply it. Extension is kind of like the idea of transfer, if you're familiar with that. It's you take something and then you transfer it to a different situation. So you can have a discussion board that does that. And all of these 4 ways of looking at discussion boards comes from a blog post. And I do have that blog post is on the reference list. So everything that I'm talking about relates to this reference list here, which is on the handout. There's another way to look at discussion boards, and that's not looking at where the discussion board fits into the class as a whole, but how you structure the board itself. And here I have 6 ideas of ways to structure boards that are not just simply, here's a reading or here's a video, discuss. The first one would be icebreaker. And one of the readings on the reference list has a nice example of this. Say you have an astronomy class, you could have an icebreaker being asking the students, what's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen in the evening sky? Which I thought was a very poetic sort of prompt, and it would also tie very nicely to the subject matter of an astronomy class. Next is jigsaw. So this is not just something for discussion boards. Jigsaw is a teaching technique generally. The idea is that you have students, everybody has a topic, everybody becomes an expert on one aspect of that topic, then they all come together, put all their information together in a whole, like a jigsaw. Assigned roles. I've actually not done this as a professor, but this is something I've encountered as a student. In addition to teaching, I actually take a whole bunch of asynchronous online courses myself. I'm a big lifelong learner. So about 2 years ago, I took a leadership course, and we had like a communication module, and I was assigned the role of busybody. So I had to monitor this chat board that was going on over a long weekend. Anytime anybody posted the discussion board, I was supposed to hop in there and put in my 2 cents. So I was playing a role. Everybody was playing roles. We didn't know what roles everybody was playing, and the point was communication styles. But you can do this a bunch of different ways. You can assign a student a role of being the person who summarizes the discussion board. So you may have a lot going on. Somebody can pull out sort of the best parts of the post. You could also have a student assigned to devil's advocate if you have sort of a controversial topic. You could have a hypo and then assign students. Some of them take the hypo from the plaintiff's perspective, some from the defendant's, maybe others from a judge perspective. Lots of ways to do this. Add an example, and that one comes directly from the readings for the presentation. In the readings, they have an example of, say you have a civil litigation course. You can create a hypothetical and then ask students, everybody contribute a discovery tool or a discovery request that would relate to this hypothetical. And everybody has to give a different example. So at the end, you've got this nice long list of different approaches to one problem. The next one is student-led. So this is just to remind you, the class is not the instructor's class. So students are perfectly capable of doing a reading and coming up with questions about that reading, and even running the board themselves. And then finally, evaluative discussion boards. Now this is one I've encountered more as a student than using it as a professor, but it can be extremely useful. So I take a lot of instructional design courses, and a lot of times you design a module.
We can see your whole screen.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. So a lot of times we will design like an online course module, we will upload it into a discussion board and then critique each other's work. And this can be extremely powerful because you're giving feedback, but because you worked on the project yourself, you kind of know it intimately, so you can give higher quality feedback to your classmates. And also it's a really great reflection tool. So I worked on this, I came up with my best spin on it, but then I can go see how other people did it and get sort of bits and pieces of ideas of things that went well, things that didn't go well. So those are different ways of running discussion boards beyond just sort of, discuss this reading. Now I want to talk about the nuts and bolts of running boards. The first thing is, how do you design the prompt? What are the students supposed to be writing about? Here, it's kind of like you want to Goldilocks things. You don't want it to be too broad. You don't want it to be too narrow. A lot of times, I have a fairly broad topic, and then I'll give them subtopics. They can either be required subtopics, or maybe there will be suggestions and ways you might go with this. And a lot of times students will take my subtopics and turn them into little headings in the post, which is perfectly fine and a great idea. For instructions, just like anything else in teaching, your instructions need to be clear. I am not particularly good at this myself. I try really, really hard, but my students always find ambiguity in my instructions. But that's like for a different talk. Instructor participation. All of the references, all of the readings that I did to prepare for this suggest that you should be participating in the discussion boards. It's really tricky though. If you participate too much, then it's not really a student-to-student sort of forum. It becomes sort of an instructor-directed forum. On the other hand, if you don't participate at all, then people are going to kind of get the message it's busy work, and they're going to kind of dull their enthusiasm for it. I personally have a very light touch in my discussion boards. I will chime in if somebody says something incorrect, or if somebody, there's something I know the students don't know. So then I will chime in. Also, I do have them do like an introductions board so that I get to know them better, and I do respond to every single student. I find some hook that I can respond to them for that board. Otherwise, another thing I do is I will write to the individual student as I'm grading, just as I would leave comments on anything else I'm grading. And that is a good way of at least signaling to them that they're not just writing these posts and sending them to the void. I am actually reading these things. And then finally, grading. Grading is really tricky on anything where you're asking people their subjective opinions. It's not really easy to sort of sort and rank people up against one another in that sort of environment. So I end up defaulting a lot of times to what I call completion grading. That means anything that's a good faith, timely effort gets full credit. If you're interested in something a little more sophisticated in terms of grading for discussion boards, in the references on the handout, there are some examples of rubrics for grading discussion boards. And then to finish up, we're going to talk about an example that came from one of my courses. This was for a first-year legal research class. What I had them do was I had them follow legal news for 7 weeks. So the class runs for 7 weeks. They chose a legal news topic that interested them. What I had them do was sign up for an email newsletter, either from Westlaw Today, Law 360, or the Bloomberg Law feeds. So they follow this news, they summarize one story per week, and then they read each other's post. So how did I implement this? I use small groups, and this comes sort of directly from the literature. The literature really says that it makes sort of the ideal discussion board has maybe 6 to 8 students on it. If you have like a 75-person class and everybody's on one board, it's not really like a conversation. It gets to be a little too unwieldy. So you work with small groups. And in addition, I worked on sort of subject-based small groups. So I had all of my public interest, social justice sort of people in a group, and then I had all of my business, transactional, tax people in a group, that sort of thing. And I thought that worked really well because they were reading posts from other students who were posting about an adjacent topic. So I thought that was very helpful. Next, I only used a few rules. And this gets to the point that you don't have to use every feature every time. I did not require students to reply to other students' posts in this particular instance. In other instances, I do. But for this particular project, I figured A, they wouldn't be terribly substantive replies, and B, I had a sneaking suspicion they would probably actually read some of the posts just because it was inherently interesting to them, and that turned out to be true. And then finally, I used completion grading. Again, this was not something where I really felt a rubric would be helpful. So if you had timely, good faith submissions, then you got full credit. So this is something I did just this past spring, even though it was an idea that I had had for a very long time. And I'm happy to say I thought it went really well, and I got really great feedback on it from the students. So that's sort of one example of a discussion board. Again, I have that here. I have sort of the pre-class survey that I sent, and then the actual prompt for the discussion board and instructions, and then I have some other ones I used as well. And with that, I think I'm pretty much out of time. Thank
If you want to dance to the end, that's okay. If M&A was dated, this is even worse. That should do a Monty Python, and now for something completely different. And something that don't pay attention to the discussion board part of this, because it violates all of those suggestions you just gave me. So, so my name is Robin Schard. I'm a librarian at the University of Miami. And I'm going to be talking about chatbots, and hopefully everybody saw in bold, this is not an AI chatbot, so I am totally violating the rules to talk about AI in this section. It's going to be no AI really. So what I am focusing on is really the collaboration point of this, and so this has been a long time thing, right? Lawyers, they never used to collaborate, right? They just always worked on it. That's such a myth, right? It never even Perry Mason had, Della and Paul and everyone else. So it's even in the old days, this is not actually the case. And so lawyers were actually working with other people. And obviously with technology, this is only expanding. There's a lot more work collaborating with non-lawyers. And when you think about things like e-discovery and big data, cybersecurity, attorneys are increasingly working with other lawyers and non-lawyers both. So it's not really going to lawyers are not really going to be able to hang out in their office. In case anybody wonders, that is not the picture of the group. Is actually none of those are lawyers. They're all silent actors, right? Silent film actors. They're forming United Artists. But the woman is actually an attorney. Her name was Mabel Willebrandt from very early 20th century. Very not as famous as she should be. So just so you know, I didn't pull these out. I did pull this out. So in law schools, right, there's been this, this constant, we need to increase the amounts of collaboration that students are doing because they are going to be working with others. So back in 1992, the MacCrate Report talked about law schools actually teaching students to collaborate with lawyers. I cut out the part where it said not just lawyers, but also others, including non-lawyers and paralegals and other groups. There are older things than this that talk about teaching students to collaborate, but most of those talk about the students just knowing, not so much collaboration so much as knowing how to manage people, which is also a good thing for students to learn. So none of you probably are old enough to remember, but 1992-ish, law students were not doing collaboration. Even non-law students were not doing that much collaboration, so there just weren't that many opportunities. This is what you did. You sat in the lecture hall and you listened or whatever. or so I'm told. I'm certainly not old enough. No, I'm just kidding. So there has been progress made. We do have opportunities now for students to collaborate. Some classes have collaboration, or students working with each other or with people outside. Certainly clinics and other spaces, students are doing more collaboration. But we're still not where business schools or MBAs are as far as teamwork in law school, right? We'll probably never get there, but we're certainly we're not giving the students as much practice as they probably will need. By the way, I also think the same thing about public speaking, but that's a different class altogether, right? So we're still not there. So the other thing is, and this is where my preparation for this took a lot of rabbit holes, because I felt like people were going to question me on this, although probably it's just in my mind. There are some psychological studies that say that lawyers, the common traits that lawyers have, are not necessarily well suited for collaboration, right? As a group, not individually, lawyers are not necessarily good at collaboration. Nobody wants to gasp and say no. That's impossible. And they're not necessarily bad traits that lawyers tend to have, but they don't necessarily speak to collaboration. So things like they're competitive, they have a higher sense of urgency than maybe other groups. And some things that are not necessarily so positive, things like their skills of empathy might be a little lower than the general population, sociability, those kinds of things. I'm sure it's totally incorrect, but skepticism, that's another one they say lawyers have. I'm telling you that I'm way off the scale with that one. And there's also studies that say that law school actually take people that are good with collaboration and make them worse with collaboration. So I can post all of that information, but in case you don't believe me. And so I take whatever opportunities I can to give the students more opportunities to collaborate, to work with each other, to work in teams, because I just don't think they get enough of an opportunity to do that. So what I'm going to be talking about today is that one of the options I use in my class, that is a technology class. It's 3 credits. So in this class I have 2 Ls, 3 Ls, and international students. Usually a few international students each semester. What else do you need to know about it? I consider it kind of a survey class where we talk about all of the different types of technology that is being used. Yeah, that's the way I refer to it, but you all know which maybe could be used in practice, maybe not all of it's being used. And it's capped at 35, so usually it runs around 35 students in the class. So that's only one pod, they don't all have to fit within all of that one seat. So the actual assignment is to create a chatbot using a product called Joseph. Is anybody working with Joseph? I know they are working with a couple of other schools. I'll talk about that in a second, but it's a no-code or a low-code product that is designed for the law. This assignment is 25% of their grade. There's several other exercises, so nothing is too difficult. And the groups are randomly assigned. So, of course, any questions I get about the assignment at the beginning of the semester always have to do with whether they get to choose the groups or I get to choose the groups. Now, I did go back and forth whether I should let them choose their own group. But my rationale was that I thought that when they went out into practice, at the beginning of their work, they would not necessarily be choosing who they worked on groups with. So that's why I also wanted to, I think if you were in the session this morning that talked about getting students to try to talk to other people, well, they don't talk that much to themselves, to each other either. So, and if you're not in your your group, you don't necessarily talk to other people unless somebody forces you to. So that's why I went with the random assignment. And so it usually ends up in groups of 4 or 5. That's what I like to stick to. If I can make that work evenly, so far it's worked out. I like 4 better than 5, but 5 works just as well if it's a full class. So like I said, Joseph is Joseph, there we go, is no code, it's low code if at best. It's basically like a decision tree, and if we have time at the end, I can show you Joseph, but it's very simple to use. It's a rules-based chatbot. It is not an AI, as I said. It's not an AI chatbot. So the students really do have to plan the whole thing out. Joseph Legal, the company that provides Joseph, is an Australian company. Just to show it's not, you don't have to use Joseph. There are lots of others. If you went to the A to J author interviewing tool, that's another example. Joseph Legal has designed an AI-based chatbot called Joseph Q that's designed for policies. So whether we switch to that or not is going to be an interesting question. So basically, Joseph can take information in. It can actually spit out answers based on the information that you've given it, and it can also be used for document automation. So you can have it take the information that you provide and create a document at the end. There are a couple of reasons why I chose Joseph. The way that actually the first way I found out about it is because before I started this assignment, I had an assignment where the students looked at a technology product, and they evaluated it. And so this was actually, Joseph Legal was actually one of the assignments in the previous version. And it came out so well that I looked into Joseph and went through their certification program. And they had a really good educational program on things like how you choose a product that would really work for a chatbot. So like how in a firm you would think about how to choose one of your processes to move to the chatbot or to document automation. They also had some really good UX or user design that was very easy to understand. I mean, I don't know, I've had mixed versions of this training on user UX design, so this seemed a lot clearer. So when I contacted them, they were really good to work with, and so it's really worked out as far as I'm concerned. And also the most important thing, Joseph is actually extremely easy to use, right? So I knew that was not going to be an issue. So that has worked out. So the students are set up in their groups. I set them up, like I said, randomly. And the first thing is they need to meet. So we do an in-class meeting. This was first on when class was online. So it was the first year that I was teaching this class, was also COVID year. That was a lot of fun. Why not, in addition to teaching a new class, all of a sudden in the middle of it had to change everything. And so collaboration was kind of rocky because you had to get the students to actually meet, and they weren't doing it so much online because they were over, like they didn't want additional Zoom meetings or anything like that. So I do let them meet in class, and Miami's a pretty big school, so the other thing is they often are in class with people they have never met before, and although we do icebreakers at the beginning of the year, this is definitely a chance for them to put names and faces together and actually have to say hello to them, to other people. So if you're in a smaller school, you might be able to skip that. And then the other thing is, there are other opportunities for the group to meet in class, but giving them the options for meeting, because again, we wanted to be sure that they were communicating to one another throughout, and not just 5 minutes before things are due. And so I do set up Microsoft Teams for them, and they have, because we've already covered other things, Slack and some other options. But of course, what they do, right? They immediately set up a text group, and no matter what other options you give them, that's what they want to do. So fine, I don't care as long as they communicate, so that works. But then I have given them an option where they don't have to share all of their text, their phone numbers. If that's a thing anymore, but it seems unlikely again. I'm old. So the other time, so basically, right, so one of the things with collaboration is that your teamwork is not going to be successful if the team doesn't have deadlines and meet those deadlines. I know you're surprised that law students put things off. Honestly, I don't have that problem whatsoever. I mean, I'm finished from grading from last semester. I mean, last week was, no, never mind. So there are a lot of deadlines built into this exercise, and that, again, I think that's an important team building skill for them to learn. So in addition to the initial meeting, they also have to meet with me during the semester or shortly after the groups are formed to discuss what the group is thinking about for their chatbot project, so what they plan to automate. And then they have to give a draft version a couple of weeks later, because somebody virtually comes from Joseph that talks about the UX design discussion. And what he does is, and sometimes the students are a little bit surprised about this, he will actually go over their chatbots as they exist in the draft. And so, he will give them suggestions. He's very positive. He's quite nice. And he takes a very, low-key kind of, he's not telling them they're doing things wrong. He always thinks he's very positive about them, but gives them suggestions for how things they can do. So then we have another group meeting after that, so they can recover from that assignment, from that review in front of the entire class. But then they've already started to build their chatbots. And then there's several other deadlines that go along with the different parts of the assignment. So the parts of the assignment, so they do have to select the process, and they do have to create the chatbot. So one of the common issues with the students is they don't like that they can't all work on the chatbot themselves at one time. So the chatbot is designed that only one person can work on it at a time. Now you can share it to the next person. And I keep trying to tell them, I don't think you would really want everybody working on it at the one time, because it's easy to unconnect one thing and have the whole thing fall apart. And so they're not buying it, though. Every feedback is, if only we could all work on it as we wanted. So after they develop the chatbot, they actually do a presentation in class, very short, because again, I told you already, I have this whole thing with they don't do enough public speaking. So somebody in the group, a couple of members of the group, I don't care, does a presentation on the chatbot. Now they don't go through the chatbot and answer the questions. What they actually do is present the purpose and what the benefits are and why they thought this was a good example of a chatbot or a use of a chatbot. And at that time, using a discussion board, the groups also post the link so that everybody else can use the chatbot. After the presentations, the students do give feedback on each other's chatbots. And the groups have to respond to whatever their colleagues have said. I don't give, I'm violating all of your rules, Julie. I don't give them a lot of explanation of what the feedback that they need to give. So sometimes it's just questions about the underlying legal use. Sometimes it's questions like why they used a specific form in Joseph. This last group, there was a lot of suggestions, actually, concrete suggestions on, why didn't you use this type of feedback versus another type of feedback. So it really varies. And like I said, the groups have to respond to this feedback. If there are actual questions, they need to respond to those. And that's kind of part of the group process. And finally, they provide a reflection on the project. So you know why I did that? Not because reflections are great, but because if it was a bad experience, I wanted them to have some place to put that, so I didn't have to hear it. No, I'm just kidding. I still hear it, but I did want them to be able to say if it was a bad experience. So their guidelines on the reflection is that they're supposed to say how the group worked, and if there are any other changes that they could have made to make the group process better. And so occasionally there are problems. The most common problem is they wish they could work together more often, or that there was communication. This is also where I get, I love it. I pat myself in the back because there's a lot of I dreaded this project, right? How many people here liked in law school or undergrad, anywhere, working on group projects? Why not?
You have to rely on other people.
You have to rely. Anything else?
Because I'm a lawyer and my skill set says don't.
I already told you what your personality traits were, yes.
Usually it's 20% of the people do 80% of the work.
Yes. So I really wanted them to be able to do this, but they're all going to be lawyers, so they are all type A. And so usually their response is, everybody did what they were supposed to do. Somebody was trying to do more, so we had to tell them, we'll do it, don't worry, kind of thing. So this is my experience with the law students when they are JD MBAs. They complain about the group projects, and they either do the entire group project or they only try to work with other lawyers in the group, or other law students in the group. So this is a lot of the feedback is, I dreaded it, I thought it was going to be horrible, but it was the best experience, or it was a good experience. A couple have said best, but I'm just going to go with good. Now you'll say, oh, they're just doing that so that you feel good, so I feel good about it. Oh, good on them, because then they're learning other skills as well. So either way, it's a learning experience. But really, how many people have actually had bad group project experiences? I definitely had, one group member hospitalized in the middle, right? And my professor's response was, oh, well, in the real world, you'd have to deal with that. Oh, well, I was already an attorney and annoyed, so I did the whole project. Okay, no problem, that response worked. So there's a lot of those kinds of things, but whatever. The reflections, I can tell ahead of time if the group didn't work exactly right, but everybody's gotten their chatbot in and it's worked, so that's all been fine. So the kinds of chatbots that they create usually divides into either a client intake form or a document, right? So these are the main things. What I worried about and what the people at Joseph also were concerned about were that the students were going to be able to come up with a process that would work correctly. I certainly did worry about that. The people I was working with at Joseph, their main response was you're going to work with them, right? You're going to do that. So they were smart there. So that has not actually been a problem. The students have lots of different ways that they have come up with plans. Actually, the one problem I came up with this semester was Two of the groups came up with exactly the same idea because there were a couple of students in my class who were also in a transactional skills program where it kind of had a similar vibe. I don't have a big problem with that. I did talk them out of doing that because they also didn't want to compete head to head in this particular aspect, so they did come up with alternatives. But that's really been the only issue. The students either, like I've had a couple who were paralegals, and so they know for the client intake specifically what kinds of questions they've had to deal with repetitively, perfect for a chatbot, good way to put the technology to use. Students in clinics have also had kind of similar experiences. And then of course there are other skills classes given these options as well. So there's never been a group that has come in and had no idea. Sometimes we futz around with what would be the best, but it's either way, they all come up with suggestions. Overall, the issues that some of the chatbots have, and you could probably imagine this, they're law students, so they do get overly legal in some of their questions. It's like why attorneys are not good at interviewing clients, right? So they know what they're trying to get to, but they're not necessarily saying it in a way that normal people would understand. So some of that does bleed through, and there's a lot of formatted text that you can use in Joseph that they sometimes will just leave as open text, and so then you can put anything. So if they ever look at when I try out their chatbots and I have my telephone number is 305-555-555-555, right? So that's because they didn't use a format that said that's not an appropriate number. So those kinds of things, those are just little things. There's an option to do a hint with all of the questions, and they don't use that enough. They don't like I don't know question options, right? If you're giving an option, yes, no, I'm not sure. They don't like the I'm not sure option. And I know why, but it's still an option that they would use more. You would see more if you were actually using a chatbot. So there are 5 areas for evaluation for this assignment. So generally, the overall development and explanation. So that includes the actual thought process, developing the process for the chatbot, and also explaining it in the presentation, right? So again, there's 2 things: collaboration and public speaking. The content, basically the carry through, not using legalese too much, making sure that whoever the audience is, they can actually understand it, and how good their responses are, and to the questions and the feedback in the discussion group. And that's just basically if they all are on the same page, they know why they did certain things, is really where that ends up. They do get, what do you call it, completion grading on their feedback on other groups. So one thing I've done correctly with the discussion boards, and then they just get completion credits on the reflection as well. They either have it or they haven't. I'm not grading whether their reflection was good or not. So that's basically that assignment, I think. Any questions for either of us? Yes.
This is my question, not from the chat.
Okay.
For when the groups are selecting their topic, how do you see I assume that some of that comes from, as you said, their knowledge they're pulling from other classes, and some groups may have one person with the doctrinal know-how and others who don't. So I'm wondering, A, if they ever struggle with the law and implementing that correctly, and how you respond to that, and 2, how that figures into the balance of workload amongst the groups since they're randomly distributed. Your thoughts? So
there is usually somebody that has more experience in this. What I see is that nobody believes that person, and so the other members of the group automatically go and learn more about that topic. And so sometimes that's actually led by the person that knows more substantively. They will make suggestions of what they should look for, or they'll find other sources. So, and then that person is usually not the person that's also the one with more technical skills. And then there's usually breaks down. You have somebody that's a little better with technical skills, somebody that knows the law, somebody that is better doing the presentation, so they'll do the presentation, and then somebody who will respond in the discussion group or to the discussion boards more than anyone else. So. Yeah, it's possibly an issue, but usually because it is focusing on different types of skills, that usually balances out in the end.
Thank you.
Or as far as they're concerned, it seems to. Yes.
For the chatbot, how do you go about addressing, is this question appropriate for chatbot or for some other means of communication versus like a branching form or something like that?
So usually it's usually they have we've already talked about process and tools like technology for using for process and automation. We've already talked about automation. So it's really not been a problem that they choose something that you wouldn't really be using a chatbot for, either to take in that information from a client or another attorney, or that you would be creating a document. Like I said, this is really a decision tree, so to that extent it is pretty close to a spreadsheet.
Okay. Second question, can you show us some examples?
If I can remember my login, I can definitely show you examples, whether I can remember my login or not, but let's see. Sorry, Julia, let's see. This is the most exciting part of the whole presentation. Can she remember this login or not?
How long have you been working with Joseph?
2 years. They actually come in. They don't come in, but they come in twice to class, and the one time they talk about like how Joseph works as a whole. And they also talk a little bit about how Joseph was designed, which gives them another example of why like chatbots would be useful. And they come in again to talk about the UX design to try and help them. Sorry. There we go. So this is one that there were a couple of students in the immigration clinic, and so this is one that they designed. They designed this in 2 languages. So for example, if you say other, it says in several languages, sorry, we can't help you. So, they really did kind of get into it. But again, part of that is because that they were doing this kind of intake for asylum seekers. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but this is basically what it does. There were some fun things. There was one student who last year who designs board games. And so he knew that was kind of a standard contract form that only a few firms actually used. So they actually created a chatbot that took in all the information that would give that form to the publisher, basically the person that created the game board. There was a group that did the SEC form, which was great, except for it took a bit to work with the form to make it look like the SEC form that you would actually be able to submit. So it's really simple. I think I also did it's really like, if you look at the flow chart, it is literally a decision tree. So you can have it go back to questions. This is an end question. This is the one that says, sorry, we can't help you in that language. And you can, basically chain back and forth, and there are rules that you can put in so that if somebody answers one way, it will send you one direction or other. But it's basically very simple to use, and the students really haven't had any problems using it.
I was wondering if you provide any instruction or readings or anything on project management to the students before you put them into groups?
So we've already handled that in class. We've already discussed that in class, yes. So we've already talked about project management. They've already gone through looking at Gantt charts and some other more advanced project management tools. Do they put those two things together? I'm not asking. But it is, again, why I have lots of deadlines built into this, because yes, it's definitely the kind of thing where they can wait till the night before and realize nobody's talked about. No, that's just me, maybe. Okay.
I've got a question for Julie. You had a beautiful array of different strategies for discussion posts, like having students play roles or so forth. And I know that's for discussion boards. Do you think those could be effective in like in-person discussions as well? Would you need to employ them differently?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things where you could, the discussion board, for example, the jigsaw, that's something that's a general teaching technique, but it's something that you could implement on a board. So a lot of these are things that are ideas that can be used generally, but you can also do them in a discussion board format. And one of the nice things about the discussion board format is because it's asynchronous for people, and introverts like me, it gives me more time to think and actually, compose my response, whereas if I was doing it in class and role playing, then I, would be, probably have lower quality.
I have a question too. So is there anything that you've moved from, like in an online, in a live class, is there anything that you've moved to discussion board that you used to do in person, or anything you think that would be perfect, that would be good for that?
I have done some things. I have moved, I'm trying to think, the Susan Elbow Mart thing where you take the exact same natural language query and you run it in a bunch of different databases.
Right.
So she has like a 15-minute video. So I assigned that. It's actually one of these. I used to do that in class. I've now moved that to doing it sort of an online, including a discussion board component.
After doing your class, have any of the law students advocated the law school using Joseph in like other instances?
They have talked to the clinics about it, yes. But one of the things they really like to do is talk to prospective employers about it, because it's something concrete where they can give an example of like the type of technology that might be adopted in a firm. So that's what I hear more, but I know some of the clinics have talked about it, yes. Good. Anything else? All right. Great. Thank you.